Neuroscience and hitting a baseball. Yogi Berra, a major league catcher, was quoted, "You can't think and hit at the same time." Through this presentation, I want to show you what is actually going on in your brain while hitting a baseball. Yogi Berra may be surprised. Throughout this presentation, we are going to focus on 4 main questions. How difficult is it to hit a baseball? What are the 3 tasks required to hit a baseball? And more specifically, what is the sensory information that the brain receives? How does it process? And then how does it coordinate muscle movement? What is the specific structures of the brain that are activated in each of these tasks and their functions? And is there a neurological difference between amateurs and Major League Baseball players? Here is a clip of the greatest sporting moment in my life. I was 12 years old and a huge Blue Jays fan.
Joe has had his moments. 2 balls and 2 strikes on it. Here's the pitch on the way. A swing and a belt. Left field. Way back. Blue Jays win. The Blue Jays are World Series champions. And Joe Carter hits a 3-run home run in the 9th inning, and the Blue Jays have repeated as World Series champions. Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life.
Facing a world-class pitcher might be one of the most intimidating prospects in all of sports. Consider the situation for a typical batter. He stands at home plate, awaiting the throw from the opposing pitcher, positioned just 60.5 feet away. A good fastball pitcher can hurl the ball at about 94 miles per hour. That means the ball covers the distance between the mound and the plate in just 439 milliseconds. To put that in context, a voluntary blink of the eye requires 150 milliseconds. In less than 3 blinks, the batter must see the ball, decide whether to swing, and then swing. It's no wonder hitting safely just 3 out of 10 at-bats is considered good. Or as Ted Williams once observed, baseball is the only field of endeavor where a man can succeed 3 times out of 10 and be considered a good performer. We're going to break down this highly difficult and skilled task into 3 smaller tasks. The first one is simply locating the ball and recognizing where it is going, and all the sensory information that is being provided to the brain. Second, the decision-making process by the hitter to answer the question to swing or not to swing. And finally, coordinating all the muscle movements. How does the brain coordinate all the muscles and tendons necessary to swing the bat at the ball? Let's take a closer look at the areas of the brain that are activated in each of these 3 tasks. We will discuss the specific structures of the brain as well as their unique functions. First task, seeing the pitch. The light reflecting off the baseball, once it leaves the pitcher's hand, enters the eye through the pupil and strikes the retina, which is a 5-layer structure that lines the back of the eyeball. The 5th layer contains visual receptors. When stimulated, the visual receptors produce signals that are conducted back through the retina to the 1st layer, composed of retinal ganglion cells. The axons of the retinal ganglion cells course across the inner surface of each eyeball and exit in a bundle called the optic nerve to the optic chiasm. Information from your left visual field and right hemiretinus, 1/2 of the retina of each eye, is conducted to the right hemisphere and vice versa, regardless of which eye it enters. From the optic chiasm, the retinal ganglion cell axons enter the brain in 2 bundles, the optic tracts. Neurons of the optic tracts terminate in the lateral geniculate nuclei of the thalamus. The axons of the lateral geniculate nuclei neurons project via the optic radiations to the obsidial primary visual cortex, which takes up much of the occipital lobes. From the primary visual cortex, visual signals are conducted through various areas of the secondary cortex, located in the prestrate cortex in each hemisphere. Visual information flows to the various areas of the primary and secondary visual cortex along a number of paths. These paths have two general routes. First, the dorsal route, which projects from the primary visual cortex to the dorsal areas of the prestrate cortex to posterior parietal cortex of each hemisphere. It focuses on location and motion. It answers the questions where things are and where they are going. The second is the ventral route, which projects primary visual cortex to ventral areas of the prestrate cortex to inferotemporal cortex. It focuses on color and form and answers the question, what things are. So now that we see the pitch, we need to make the decision to swing or not to swing. Before an accurate movement can be initiated, the sensory motor system must know the current position of the body parts that are to be moved and the position of external objects with which the body is going to interact. This information is supplied to the posterior parietal cortex by the visual, auditory, and somatosensory systems. The posterior parietal cortex supplies information to the motor areas of the frontal lobe, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which provides a mental representation of objects to which the subject is going to respond and initiates voluntary movements. Signals from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex project to the four areas of the secondary motor cortex in each hemisphere. There is a supplementary motor area located in the dorsal frontal cortex, just anterior to the precentral gyrus. There's the premotor cortex, located in ventral frontal cortex, just anterior to the precentral gyrus. And there are two cingulate motor areas, located in the cingulate gyrus. The supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex are involved in planning sequences of voluntary movements before they are initiated. From the secondary motor cortex, the information goes to the primary motor cortex, located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So we have seen the ball and have decided to swing. What does the brain do to get the body moving? Electrical stimulation of each point on the surface of the primary motor cortex often causes muscles on the contralateral side of the body to contract. The primary motor cortex is organized somatotropically and called the motor homunculus, which is shown in the picture on the right. To carry out goal-directed movements, your motor cortex must first receive information about the body's position from two loops involving the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which help to initiate and coordinate the activation of the muscles in sequence. The basal ganglia loop is a continuous signal that travels through the cortex to the pitumen, to the globus pallidus, to the thalamus, and back to the cortex. The loop involving the cerebellum first receives information about the intended movement from the sensory and motor cortexes. Then it sends information back to the motor cortex about the required direction, force, and duration of this movement. These two loops work in conjunction with each other to select and trigger well-coordinated voluntary movements. In addition, to ensure that all these movements are fast, precise, and coordinated, the nervous system must constantly receive sensory information from the outside world and use this information to adjust to the trajectory of the ball. The nervous system achieves these adjustments chiefly by the means of the cerebellum. The axons of the neurons of the primary motor cortex descend all the way to the spinal cord, where they make their final relay of information to the motor neurons via the pyramidal tract, which includes both the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tract. From there, the peripheral motor nerves carry the motor impulses from the spinal cord to the voluntary muscles, causing them to contract and finally hit the baseball. Just to recap, all 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex are activated while hitting a baseball. The occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes are engaged in the initial task of seeing the pitch. Signals from the retina are sent to the visual receptors that travel along the optic nerve to the optic chiasm to the genunucleate nucleus. From there, it travels through the optic radiations to the primary visual cortex to the secondary visual cortex via 2 routes, the dorsal route and the ventral route. These 3 lobes are also involved in knowing the current position of the body parts that are going to be moved to hit the ball, as well as the trajectory of the ball. Information from the visual, auditory, and somatosensory systems is sent to the parietal cortex. The frontal lobe is then activated to plan the sequencing of movements by the hitter. The parietal cortex sends signals to the secondary motor cortex in the frontal lobe. From the secondary motor cortex, signals travel to the primary motor cortex. Not only are the lobes of the cerebral cortex involved with hitting the baseball, the motor cortex also receives information from the basal ganglia and cerebellum. They work together to select and trigger well-coordinated voluntary movements. Then finally, the primary motor cortex sends signals to the spinal cord and contracts the muscles. In short, the brain is very involved in hitting a baseball. There seems to be a lot going on in the brain to hit a ball. I want to know, is there a neurological difference between amateurs and professional ball players that allow the pros to hit a 94-mile-per-hour fastball? If you've ever tried to hit a baseball pitched at major league speeds, it feels impossible, and technically, it just might be. So what changes in a professional ball player's brain that allows them to hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball? The batter has 439 milliseconds to swing at a ball. Then since the ball leaves the pitcher's hand, it takes 75 milliseconds for the batter's eye to form a picture and send it to the brain. 25 milliseconds for the retina to process incoming data. 20 milliseconds for the data to travel to the brain. Another 30 milliseconds for the brain to construct the image out of the information. As the ball travels towards the plate, additional images arrive in the brain every 25 milliseconds, like frames in a motion picture. The batter then has about 50 milliseconds for thinking, to swing or not to swing. Next, the batter's brain must send signals to the muscles of his legs, torso, and arms. This manifests itself as electrochemical impulses originating in the cerebral cortex and then zipping along nerve fibers to the extremities. In all, it takes 25 milliseconds for the impulses to get from the brain to the individual muscle fibers. Finally, the muscles respond, but not instantly. A baseball swing requires a full 150 milliseconds to complete. That means a good batter is well into a swing when the ball is still about 18 feet from home plate. If he's 10 milliseconds too early or too late, he'll miss the ball completely. In order to complete the swing before the ball reaches the plate, major league hitters also tend to use their frontal cortex, the part of the brain that is generally in charge of deliberate decision-making, less than amateurs. Researchers say that this diminished frontal participation is crucial. Players seem to make the decision in their motor cortex rather than their frontal cortex. Their brains recognize and act on pitches more efficiently. Another key area that appears to be more energized among professional hitters is a supplementary motor area. It is involved in the coordination of sequence of pre-planned movements such as hitting. In expert hitters, this area is especially active as the pitcher winds up and as the pitch approaches the plate. Simply put, major league batters are better at preparing for the pitch.
Here's another interesting video of researchers' findings of professional ball players' brains.
The average MLB player has 20/12 vision, and it's a quality scouts look at when assessing players. It also helps to get a head start. Hitters will begin their forward motion before the pitch is delivered. They have about 50 milliseconds to decide to check their swing. After that, the bat will be moving too fast to be stopped. But the ultimate trait that helps major leaguers hit the fastball is the ability to see into the future. Well, Sort of. Our brains are really good at anticipating information that we haven't yet received to make up for our lag in vision. Researchers at UC Berkeley tested this by showing volunteers flash drag illusions like this one. If you pause the video, you see the red and blue dots actually appear in the same position. But while watching it in motion, they look slanted in the direction that the background is rotating. This is because our brains are predicting the motion of the dots based on the information we're receiving from the movement of the background. The same applies in baseball. Hitters begin predicting the trajectory of the ball based on the movement of the pitcher's arm before it even leaves his hand. This makes up for the fact that he won't actually see the pitch until it's a quarter of the way towards him. So you have to admit, hitting a major league fastball seems nothing short of superhuman.
To conclude this presentation, I would have to disagree with Yogi Berra. A more accurate quote would be, "You have to think in order to hit, but you better make it fast."